Great. It's so good to be with you this morning. My name is Caleb. If I've not met you, it's good to kind of meet you a little bit. I'm married to a lovely lady named Kathleen. She's a teacher, and we're just loving being part of this church community. So we're currently in week 3 of a series called Psalms. Mind, body, soul, spirit, Jesus. And the whole vision for this series is that we would take Jesus and His Word below the surface reality of our lives, into the depths of our souls and hearts, into what Gordon MacDonald, a famous author, describes as our private world. And that as we do that we would find healing, peace, and hope. And the topic I'm going to speak about today isn't actually often covered in church circles because it's a very difficult topic. It's a very deep topic, yet it's a topic that actually impacts every single one of us, regardless of where you stand in your faith. And the topic I want to speak about is, how do we grieve well? How does our faith and how does grieving coexist? You see, grief comes to all of us on varying levels and intensity. And it even comes to those that follow Jesus. In John 16, Jesus Himself said, "In this life, you will have many troubles." No matter what you believe, I'm sure we can all agree with Jesus' words. And today I specifically want to speak about the type of grief that keeps you awake at night and shakes the foundations of your whole world. Could be the death of a friend or a family member, like my wife and I experienced a few years ago. It could be a medical diagnosis that crushes your dreams and your future. It could be a spouse that stopped loving you. Or it could even be the grief that comes to us when others, because of their actions or sin, they hurt us. I think of extreme cases in the church space where church leaders have failed us, and it's caused people to have to leave their church community and start all over again. It's these intense moments of grief that I want to speak about today, the ones that leave us absolutely broken and overcome and sleepless and deep in trouble. And I just want to say, maybe you're not experiencing this right now. Maybe you're actually in a great season. Maybe you've got a little one on the way, or you just got married, or your job is going really well right now. The reality is that this is an important topic for every one of us because of 2 reasons. Number one, we all know people that are grieving deeply in life. But number two, there's a strong probability that this level of intense grief will one day reach you. And I guess that's the bad news. The bad news is that this level of intense grief actually comes to us all in one way or another. But the good news is that God doesn't abandon us in our grief. And really, my hope today is to show us that real grief can coexist with faith. And more importantly, that we can actually only find ultimate comfort for our souls when they coexist in a relationship with God. And so today I want to speak about grieving with God. Grieving with God. That's really my big idea, and my hope is to answer this question. What do we do when we face grief? Well, Psalm 77 answers this exact question for us and actually teaches us how to grieve with God. And so that's what we're going to be reading from. You can open your Bibles with me. And Psalm 77 was actually a lament that was sung together by God's people as they encountered deep hardship and struggle together. Yet at the same time, as you'll see, it's a deeply personal lament. So I'm going to invite Celeste up, and she's going to read Psalm 77 for us.
Psalm 77. I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for His help. You don't let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to pray. I think of the good old days long since ended when my nights were filled with joyful songs. I search my soul and ponder the difference now. Has the Lord rejected me forever? Will he never again be kind to me? Is his unfailing love gone forever? Has his promises permanently failed? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he slammed the door on his compassion? And I said, this is my fate. The Most High has turned his hand against me. But then I recall all you've done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They are constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. Oh God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. You demonstrate your awesome power among the nations. By your strong arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the Red Sea saw you, O God, its waters looked and trembled. The sea quaked to its very depths. The clouds poured down rain. The thunder rumbled in the sky. Your arrows of lightning flashed. Your thunder roared from the whirlwind. The lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your road led through the sea, your pathway through the mighty waters, a pathway that no one knew was there. You led your people along that road like a flock of sheep, with Moses and Aaron as their shepherds. This is the word of the Lord.
It's incredible that is the Bible. And I think Psalm 77 actually shows us 4 ways that we can and should grieve with God. And my hope this morning is to unpack those for us. And so let's dive in together. The first way that Psalm 77 teaches us to grieve authentically with God is that it teaches us to come to God personally. Verses 1 and 2 says, I cry out to God, yes, I shout. So it's okay to get noisy when you come to God in your pain. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. As I mentioned, this psalm is actually a lament, and I'm sure some of you are wondering, what is a lament? Well, it's actually just a fancy word for describing an honest cry out to God. And it's a cry that expects an answer from God, and therefore it results in hope and in joy rather than despair. And the reason why lamenting is so important for us in our grief is because it invites God into the depths of our pain, what we would normally consider to keep away from God. And so Psalm 77 is this community lament that was sung together by God's people as they endured intense hardship and pain. But just because it's a community lament doesn't make it impersonal. Psalm 77 actually shows us that there's 2 ways that we should come to God personally. We should come to God personally on our own, but we should also come to God personally together with God's people. We should firstly come to God personally on our own. Look at verses 6. Asaph writes, he says, when my nights were filled with joyful songs, I searched my soul and ponder the difference now. Here's Asaph in the middle of the night, meeting with the Lord. He's alone. He's probably got some worship music playing. He's sitting on the floor of his room, and he's in the middle of an incredibly dark valley. And so he comes to God in song. Maybe you know what it's like to sit up at night with worship music playing, meeting with God in prayer and worship as you try and drift off to sleep and experience something of His comfort. But sometimes when we're grieving, even sleep is difficult. Asaph in verse 4 says, you don't even let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to pray. That's the NLT. The ESV says, you hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled I can't even speak. It's in these moments of grief that we just sit and experience the presence of God. We don't pray. We don't sleep. We just allow the truth of who God is to wash over us. My family's experienced some incredibly deep, intense grief. And I remember in high school, many mornings coming downstairs, getting ready for school. I was probably 16 at the time. And I would find my mom on the couch, sleeping with her Bible still open on the coffee table, everything the way it was from the night before, from her praying through the night. We come to God personally on our own, but not just that, we also come to God personally together with God's people. See, Psalm 77 is this community song. You and I were created for community, and so we're supposed to not just grieve on our own, but we're actually supposed to grieve in the context of community too. You see, as the body of Christ, we're actually called to share each other's grief. We're called to be able to be people that are able to celebrate when we're celebrating, but also mourn when we're mourning. Mourn with those who mourn. Romans 12 says this. It says, rejoice with those who rejoice. But it also says mourn or weep with those who weep. You see, a church is supposed to be a community where we can weep together. Christianity is not about pretending everything's okay and then calling it faith. Church and small group should not be about pretending everything's okay. It should be instead defined by authenticity. And so if you're a Christ follower and you're part of this community, I want to encourage you. I want to encourage you to share your joys, but also share your grief with this community. And maybe at this point you'd push back and say, Caleb, I don't feel comfortable being vulnerable with people in the church. I don't like crying in front of people. I don't like losing control of my emotions in front of people. I just want to reassure you that we're all substantially weaker than we actually look. We're all substantially more emotional than we actually look. And we're all much more messy and broken than we actually look when we get in our cars and come here on a Sunday morning. The reality is that the church is a group of people that don't have it all together. We don't have it all together. And this means that we can do life together. It also means we can grieve together. And so I want to encourage you in your grief, come to God personally. Come to Him on your own, but also come to Him together with God's people. Once we've come to God personally, the second way I think Psalm 77 teaches us to grieve with God is that it teaches us to complain to God. Honestly. See, these Psalms of Lament give us permission to be honest with God. God is big enough to handle your emotions. He's big enough to handle your questions. Look at some of these other Psalms so we can see that this is not just an exception. Psalm 44, the psalmist writes, wake up, O Lord. Why do you sleep? Get up. Do not reject us forever. Why do you look the other way? Why do you ignore our suffering and our oppression? Psalm 13, O Lord, how long will you forget me? Just wondering. Forever? How long will you look the other way? See, the psalmist is asking some incredibly tough questions here, and maybe you can relate to this. Maybe you know what it's like to grieve honestly with God and find yourself asking incredibly deep questions. Questions like, why did a good God allow that to happen? Why didn't God bring about what was right in this situation? How can a good and loving God allow such suffering and pain? Those are really good questions. Those are not questions we should shy away from, and I don't want to answer them in my sermon today because we don't have enough time, but I do want to point you in the direction of some helpful answers. The first is a book by C.S. Lewis. It's called The Problem of Pain. It's a brilliant book that unpacks suffering and God. And the second book is by Timothy Keller. It's called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. God is big enough to handle the questions we ask Him in the midst of our grief. And for those still exploring faith in Jesus, maybe you haven't crossed the line of faith yet, I want to encourage you to try this. I want to encourage you to get honest with God, because I'm convinced that there's no worldview besides faith in Jesus that can truly provide ultimate comfort for you in the midst of your grief and pain. See, as we walk through the darkest valleys of our life, our relationship with God has to remain honest. We should pour out our unfiltered hearts before Him. And Asaph leads the way for us in Psalm 77. Look at verses 7 and 9. He says, "Has the Lord rejected me forever? Will he never again be kind to me? Is his unfading love gone forever? Has his promises permanently failed? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he slammed the door on his compassion?" And at this point, I do want to point out that complaining to God honestly is different from grumbling against God. Because grumbling against God is what the Israelites did when they were taken out of Egypt and taken through the desert to the promised land. They grumbled against God. And when we grumble, we actually faithlessly move away from God towards something else. We look back to the way things were and we kind of just want to go back. Whereas when we faithfully complain to God, we actually complain with a measure of faith toward Him. We complain looking to how things should be in God, looking to the future. Complaining honestly to God is like that cliche movie scene where the wife who's going through some terrible grief or pain beats on the chest of her husband in anger and in confusion, and yet ultimately collapses into his embrace and into his care. That's what it means to complain honestly to God. So in our grief, let's complain to God. Let's be honest with Him. Third way that Psalm 77 teaches us to grieve with God is that we see that we should ask God hopefully. Asaph actually opens this lament with verse 1. He says, "I cry out to God, yes, I shout, oh, that God would listen to me." Asaph here is simply asking God to listen to him. Sometimes we kind of switch over. We start by asking God with hope, and then we transition to complaining honestly to God, and then we complain honestly to God, and that leads us to asking God again with hope. But it's important to remember that God doesn't just want us to come to Him with our complaints. He also wants us to come to Him with our requests. Charles Spurgeon said, "Prayer is the slender nerve that moves the muscle of God's omnipotence or His all-powerfulness. In the midst of our grief, we can pray for things to be on earth as they are in heaven. We can pray and make our requests known before God. We can pray to God knowing that if it's not so now, it will be so one day in heaven." And so we ask God with hope because we know how the story ultimately ends for God's children. Revelations 21 tells us of this future hope. It tells us of how the story ends. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and first earth had passed away." That's where we are right now. It's passed away. "And there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who was seated on the throne said, 'I'm making everything new.'" Church, this moment exists in time. It's real. It exists in time, and it's coming. And so we can ask God with hope now because we have a future hope. We come to God personally. We complain to God honestly. We ask God hopefully. And finally, we trust in God ultimately. Asaph writes in verses 11 and 12, "But then I recall all you've done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They're constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works." Asaph, as well as God's people, they're finding their trust in God again. But how do we find our trust in God in the middle of our grief? Well, I think verses 11 and 12 show us something unique. Verses 11 and 12 shows us that ultimately trusting God is a matter of small steps of faith and trust. It's actually an accumulation of many more steps of faith and trust. Look at verses in 11 and 12. What do you notice? You notice there's a deliberate effort from Asaph to remember God for who He is. He uses words like, I recall, I remember, I cannot stop thinking. Sometimes trust in God is like climbing a massive mountain. All you can really do is take one small step at a time. And that's what Asaph is doing here. Here are his small steps of trust. I recall, I remember, I think about it. And this is the fight of faith. Every time you feel overcome in your grief, you look again to Jesus who conquered brokenness on the cross, and you find renewed strength and you take another step. Every time you feel hopeless and you feel like darkness is just overcoming you, you remember the story of Revelation 21. You remember how it ends. And so the light of Jesus comes bursting through again into your soul. And so we trust God one small step at a time. But don't get mistaken here. This is a painful and a slow process. It's much easier spoken about than it is practiced, as is pretty much everything we're speaking about today. There's no way of describing how difficult it is to genuinely trust God when you're in the middle of a storm. Kathleen and I, my wife and I, we got married when we were 21. And one day after being married about 8 months, we were having lunch with her parents on a Sunday afternoon. And her mom kind of lost her words at the lunch table and started to speak funny. We thought it was maybe an epileptic fit or like a bit of a seizure. The next day she went for an MRI, and the doctors told us that she had a brain tumor the size of a tennis ball, and they needed to do an emergency operation and a biopsy. After the surgery, we sat down with the doctors and they told us the news. Stage 4 glioblastoma brain cancer. The most aggressive type of brain cancer, and in our case, no chance of survival. 3 months later, her mom passed away. Kathleen was best friends with her mom. And it's hard for me to describe how dark that season was for us. How difficult it was to trust God. But looking back, I thank God that we had a relationship with Him before that storm hit. Because if we didn't, we would have been in deep trouble. There's a strong chance I wouldn't be married today if we didn't have Jesus in our life when that storm hit us. And I'm thankful that our roots of trust in God were grown years before that storm hit. And I want to encourage you, don't wait for the storm to hit before you cultivate your trust in Jesus. Trusting God should be a way of life, moment by moment and step by step. Every time we open our Bible, our roots of trust grow a little bit deeper. Every time we hear a testimony of someone in small group, our roots of trust grow a little bit deeper. Every time we sing a song of praise like we did this morning, or you're in the car on your way to work, our roots of trust grow a little bit deeper. Every time you pray a prayer, your roots of trust grow a little bit deeper. Trusting God is an accumulation of many small, deliberate acts that drive the roots of our lives into the bedrock of Christ. So that like Asaph, when the storm hits us, our hearts can say, "You are the God of great wonders. You demonstrate your awesome power among the nations. By your strong arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph." As we grieve with God, we can ultimately trust Him. I'm going to come in for a landing. We can only find ultimate comfort for our souls when our grief genuinely exists in the context of a relationship with God. And I just love how Psalm 77 closes, because the final 2 verses conclude with this meditation on how God saved Israel from Pharaoh, leading them through the Red Sea. Asaph writes this, he says, "Your road led through the sea, your pathway through the mighty waters, a pathway no one knew was there. You led your people along that road like a flock of sheep, with Moses and Aaron as their shepherds. See, this is more than just a picture of God saving a certain people of a certain time. Asaph didn't actually know this at the time, but many years later, there'd be another great exodus. Many years later, Jesus would come in to the world and he would lead his people out of sin and death through those waters and into redemption and life. You see, in Jesus, God steps into the grief and the sorrow of our world, and he leads us into his kingdom of hope and healing. In fact, Jesus on the cross even cried out in lament, and he fulfilled the words of Psalm 22. He said, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus cried those words on the cross so that you and I don't have to cry them today. You see, the cross of Christ is proof that Jesus is not only willing to save us from our grief, but it's also proof that he loves us. It's proof that he loves us. He saves us and he understands us. Isaiah 53 describes Jesus as a man who was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with the deepest of griefs. See, I may not be able to understand what you've been through in your life. I may not be able to understand your grief. People around you, people in your small group, they may not be able to understand, but Jesus understands. Jesus knows this morning. He feels. And the good news of the gospel is that we can find ultimate comfort for our souls when our grief exists in the context of a beautiful relationship with our Father in heaven. Let's bring our grief to Jesus this morning.